and winter programming. The church is planning generally to have several services a month in the sanctuary based on social distances and other restrictions, as well as at least one service a month virtually. We will try and match that as best as we can. We will certainly have 1 to 2 programs a month virtually on Zoom, and at least one or more in our very storied special room, the fireside room, where much of the controversial questions are posed to our guest speakers. So I want to introduce you, and another one of the benefits of this virtual era, we can show our guest in another way, which we'll have on in a moment. And what I want to do now is take you to our guest, Mr. Mel Goodman's website here. And I'll give you his background that is shown on his website. You may recognize the picture of our handsome guest, Melvin Goodman. From this point forward, we will refer to him as part of our extended family, Mel. And Mel has been a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy in Washington, D.C., is an adjunct professor at international relations at Johns Hopkins University. He's had a 42-year government career, including tours in the Central Intelligence Agency, the Department of State, and the Department of Defense's National War College, where he is was a professor of international security. He's a resident in Montgomery County, and Mel has quite a prolific background in writings of foreign policy issues in op-ed pieces, professional journals, YouTube videos, blogs, essays, public talks, and an author of 11 critical foreign policy books, and most recently, his book, National Security State, containing the National Security State, is his most recent book, which will be available shortly at Politics and Prose, and is available at his website, which I'll mention right now. Also, American Carnage is available now at Politics and Prose. These are his 4 most recent books, and we're going back in his time, and all the way back into the Edward Shevardnadze era in the Gorbachev period. So we will be able to have a continued discussion with Mel at his book launch on Wednesday, June 16th at 7 p.m. His website is melvingoodman.com, melvingoodman.com, and if you go into search, you should find that. So on that, I would like to introduce Mel to carry on with our conversation. And Loretta, if we could bring him into the screen. And welcome, Mel. Thank you once again for joining us. We're always look forward to your latest perspective of how this changing world is happening with our foreign policy. And we pass it over to you, Mel. And if you could reduce me from the screen and let Mel have the full screen now. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you also for the invitation, even though I do miss your fireside room. It was very conducive to the very good discussions we had after the several talks that I gave there. I also want to thank Nancy, a special hello to Nancy, who I think has always been responsible for getting me invited there in the first place. So good to see you, Nancy. Thanks a lot. As Carl mentioned, 42 years basically in the intelligence business with high-level security clearances. You would think I would be very cynical at this point. I'm not. I'm a skeptic, not a cynic, and there's a very important difference there. And one of the things I'm skeptical about and why I like to do these talks is because of the government's emphasis on protecting its so-called secrets. Most of what the government protects is its own reputation. It doesn't like to be embarrassed. That's why it takes such a hard-nosed position toward declassification, and people like myself who write and have to submit books for pre-publication clearance, which is a very capricious, unreasonable system. If actually I'm suing the CIA right now. Our case was just heard in the Fourth Circuit in Richmond. We didn't get a very fair hearing, but we don't have the results of it yet. But it's basically to get a fair system for allowing former intelligence officers to publish these materials. Because my feeling is people such as yourselves and your groups, the Unitarian Church, people who are committed to a saner world, I think need a lot of this official business. It needs to be declassified. It's not all that sensitive. It's not going to hurt the national interests of the United States. It's not going to compromise our sovereignty. It's not going to weaken our defenses. But it will allow you to make better decisions about who to vote for and who to understand. So I approached the entire global scene as very unpredictable. I don't like the expression world order. People like Henry Kissinger write books about world order, or Richard Haas of the Council on Foreign Relations. There is no world order. The world is unpredictable, which is why we have so many intelligence failures in the first place. And also the world, for the most part, is governed with very little wisdom. The United States is a very good example of that. Of course, coming out of 4 years of Donald Trump is particularly ludicrous. So the only lesson we really learn is that there are no lessons from history. If there were any lessons from history after the mistakes of Vietnam, we wouldn't have repeated these mistakes in Iraq in 2003, which was particularly outrageous because of the lies that George W. Bush and Dick Cheney told over the years. And the fact that we engaged in Afghanistan for 20 years is also rather outrageous. So the only wisdom I'd like to pass on, one of the rare examples of wisdom, would be something Eisenhower said on his way out of the White House in January of 1961, when he had all of his key advisors around him. And he said, "God help the United States when the people who sit in my chair here in the Oval Office do not understand the military, do not know how to deal with the military, and are just not schooled on the thinking of the military." And by and large, if you look at American presidents, they're rather clueless on dealing with the military. And some of them, in the case of, Barack Obama is a very good example. I think he was intimidated by the military. That's when he made the outrageous decision to maintain Robert Gates as his Secretary of Defense, which made no sense whatsoever.
Mel, excuse me, may I enter in for one moment? I'm
Yes.
sorry, I want to talk to the audience. I did overlook in the beginning to outline how we will be taking questions. As we've been doing of late, we would like you to ask your questions in the chat box. That way we will make sure they're answered. Loretto will be able to group them, but please do that. Feel free to take your notes down to ask questions later. If there is time, we will be able to turn it over to the person-by-person format. And Mel has offered to spend a little bit of extra time if we need to beyond our 12:45 cutoff. So thank you very much, and back to you, Mel. Thank you.
Yeah, well, the point I wanted to conclude with in terms of an introduction is we do have a president who does understand the military. And I think Joe Biden deserves a lot of credit for trying to warn Barack Obama not to get boxed in by the military. And he told him this in 2009, when Barack Obama was inclined to reduce troops in Afghanistan, but the military wanted to increase troops in Afghanistan. And Biden was very much against this. That's why it's no surprise to me that one of his initial steps was to pull the switch on Afghanistan. I know a lot of people are skeptical about whether we're really getting out. We are getting out. It's been 20 years and a couple $1 trillion and too much loss of blood and treasure, but we are finally getting out of that ridiculous 2 decades of war. The interesting thing about Biden to me, and it's a question I can pose, all of you will have answers to it. How did this very boring candidate become such an interesting president over the the period we refer to in part of the political lexicon as the 100 days. And we've been using the 100 days as a marker since Franklin D. Roosevelt. We shouldn't confuse any president with FDR, however. His 100 days were incredible. There was at least 75 pieces of legislation that were introduced and passed in the first 100 days. Some of that legislation changed the direction of this country. It's what Republicans have been trying to reverse for the last 30, 40 years. But Biden has approached the presidency with a great deal of energy, with readiness. He's identified all the right problems. He knows we have to engage in rebuilding the nation state at home before we take on nation state building abroad, which we shouldn't be doing in any event. If we can't rebuild Baltimore, I don't know why in the hell we think we can rebuild Baghdad or Kabul, but that's another problem. But the thing that Biden has really attacked with tremendous energy and hasn't really gotten credit for is reversing what Trump's advisor, a man by the name of Steve Bannon, called the deconstruction of the administrative state. And I don't think pundits have been very fair in describing the tremendous destruction to the administrative state, to governance.
Zishan, good morning to you. How are you? Zishan, I am on a Zoom meeting. I will call you back in about an hour and a half.
Hey, can't we do something about ambient noise or interruptions? But anyway, Biden has clearly addressed the problem of rebuilding government. When you get to national security field, what he has done is rather remarkable. Now, there are some problems that have been created. I'm not totally supportive of everything Biden has done, and I'll get to that. But you have to look at national security, to me, in terms of three issues: personnel, policy, and process. And when you try to critique Donald Trump on these three areas, the results are just miserable. So Biden ended up with one of the most wretched inheritances of any president in American history. Personnel, I don't have to go into that in any kind of detail, but when you look at the various agencies of the national security arena, the State Department, Rex Tillerson, who wasn't qualified, Mike Pompeo, who was downright dangerous, CIA, you had Pompeo at the start, and then you had the woman who was one of the leading cheerleaders and implementers of torture and abuse, Gina Haspel, made a CIA director. That was indeed outrageous. Department of Defense began with James Mattis. I was critical of that because I'm opposed to a military officer being named Secretary of Defense. Biden, by the way, has done that as well, and I'm not happy about it. And then when Mattis turned out to be the moderate in the group in terms of national security, the people who followed Mattis were far worse. People like Shanahan and Esper and Miller. I doubt if everyone even remembers these people as secretaries of defense. If you look at the director of national intelligence, the first one was good, and that's why he was forced out. That was Dan Coates, the former senator from Indiana. But then when you look at the people who follow him, not so much McGuire, but people like Richard Grenell, and then John Ratcliffe, this was the period that marked the politicization of intelligence under Donald Trump. Very dangerous. NSC, you had Michael Flynn, who couldn't last a month. You had H.R. McMaster, an active duty 3-star general, and he couldn't even get support from the 4-star general who was Secretary of Defense. So there was no communication between the NSC and the Pentagon during that period. And then you get people like John Bolton, who's one of the most dangerous people who ever served in the United States government. And then O'Brien, who was a hostage lawyer who became a hostage. So when you look at Biden's people, by and large, they're pretty good. I'm particularly pleased with the CIA appointment because it's William Burns from the Department of State, the first foreign service officer ever to lead the CIA. And I think he's got the right qualifications in terms of someone who's had to deal with intelligence, knows the limits of intelligence, and knows the importance of intelligence to finding opportunities in policy. So that's particularly important. Anthony Blinken, we'll see. He's certainly tried to save Biden from the disaster Biden created over the immigration issue. That has finally been fixed to a certain extent. Blinken did his best to keep Biden from making the mistake. Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, I think is very good. That's a very good appointment. As I mentioned earlier, I'm not happy with Austin, a former four-star general, as a Secretary of Defense, because you shouldn't have a military man running the Department of Defense. That should be a civilian. The first exemption was for someone who was rather unusual. That was George C. Marshall. Mattis and Austin are not cut from the same cloth. Few people are, as George C. Marshall. And then the final appointment, the Director of National Intelligence, the so-called National Intelligence Czar, is Avril Haines. I'm not happy with that appointment because Haines was the deputy to CIA Director John Brennan when Brennan and Haines were trying to compromise the effort of the Senate Intelligence Committee to collect research on the CIA's program of torture and abuse. And Haines was a big backer of Gina Haspel as a CIA director. That to me should have disqualified her, but she's off to a decent start, and we'll just have to decide. So personnel, I think Biden's moved it in the right direction. These are very good people. And to quote Ronald Reagan, personnel is policy. You know, the people you pick sort of give you a clue to the kind of policy you're going to implement. And the best example of that, now that we're on policy, is getting back to the Iran nuclear accord, which was a very good agreement when it was negotiated by John Kerry. And it's interesting to me that Biden has brought back into the government all of the people who negotiated the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the nuclear accord with Iran. So John Kerry is back in the White House. Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, was John Kerry's number 2 in these negotiations. William Burns, the CIA director, was the first person to establish the secret contacts with the Iranian leadership, particularly in the Rouhani government, and meeting with the foreign minister, Zarif, a very important moderate in Iran. He's brought back Wendy Sherman, who was an advisor on disarmament, a real pro. So she's back in the State Department. And he's named Robert Malley as a special emissary. Sorry about that. Malley and Blinken are old colleagues. They actually went to high school together in Paris. They're both children of refugee families. And Malley is a real progressive on the Middle East. Someone whose career I've watched for a long time. So I think this is a very good appointment. My only problem with the Iran policy is Biden's moving much too slowly. I think Iran is right. Their position is we're not going to sit down with you directly until you get back into the agreement. We left the agreement. We had no reason to leave the agreement. The agreement was being adhered to. So we marched out. Iran's position is if you want direct talks, you march back in. And that's what we're waiting for. So meanwhile, you have these talks taking place. Remember, it's an international agreement. It wasn't just a bilateral agreement between the United States and Iran. It included Russia and China, Britain, France, and Germany. So all of these countries, except the United States, are meeting at the Intercontinental Hotel in Vienna. And down the street, you have Robert Malley in a different hotel with messengers coming on a regular basis about what's being talked about, what's being agreed to in these international meetings. This is ludicrous. So Biden's got to get moving there. In other areas, he's moved well. He's back in the Paris Climate Agreement, which we never should have left. And he was a forceful speaker at the Climate Summit that the United States had a lot to do with. He's back in the world of arms control and disarmament, which I think is key. He moved quickly to extend the New START agreement, which was the only strategic agreement that was left after the damage done by George W. Bush, who pulled us out of ABM, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, and Donald Trump, who pulled us out of the INF, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. And what's interesting, and why I'm such a critic of John Bolton, Bolton was a key advisor to both administrations. He was the national security advisor, encouraging Trump to get out of INF, and he was a disarmament specialist at the State Department, urging an end to the ABM Treaty. The ABM Treaty was the key to strategic deterrence. It was a very important treaty. You can't really reduce offensive weapons until you agree you shouldn't have defensive weapons. So hopefully Biden understands that. Biden is putting us back into the United Nations Human Rights Council. He's restored aid, humanitarian aid to Palestinians, which Donald Trump turned off, just turned off the spigot of very important aid to the Palestinian communities in the West Bank and Gaza. Israel has turned Gaza into an outdoor prison, in my estimation, and I think pressure should be put on Israel to do something about that. I don't know what Biden is willing to do. Democratic presidents are not willing to move very forcefully in that direction. But I was impressed by the slight protocol aspect of Biden waiting about 3 or 4 weeks because before he even would call Netanyahu. So a lot of the strong men around the world who are still waiting for calls, like Orban in Hungary and Duterte in the Philippines, he hasn't touched base with them, and Bibi had to wait 3 or 4 weeks, and I hope Netanyahu appreciated that rebuff for what it is. Israel has its own problems because they can't seem to elect a government. They're facing their 5th election in the last 2 years, so you don't know who to really put pressure on in Israel without a real government in place. I think Biden has put emphasis on our alliances, which is good, particularly the transatlantic alliance and improving relations with the Europeans, particularly with France and Germany. Germany's facing its own election, and we're going to lose Merkel, to me, the outstanding leader of the free world over the last couple of years, particularly during the Trump period. And Macron is going to face a tough election the next time around. Biden has even put greater emphasis on what is known as the Quad. I don't know how familiar people are with the Quad. This started out as a humanitarian alliance between the United States, India, Australia, and Japan to do something about the natural disasters in the Pacific in order to get humanitarian aid out more quickly and more efficiently. But it's turning into hopefully a diplomatic alliance to try to challenge the influence of China in the Pacific as a competitive organization, not as a North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's not going to be a military arrangement, but it could be a very important diplomatic device. And I think in terms of China, which I'll get to in a second, the fact that the first 2 visitors, we've seen one, the Japanese President Suga, who was just here, and the South Korean President Moon will be the next visitor to the White House. I think what Biden is doing is suggesting that he knows that the #1 foreign policy problem that we face is China. This is going to be the Asian century. You know, the 20th century was the European century, and the role of the United States in the West. The 21st century is going to be the Asian century in terms of the very successful economies out there and the increased influence and presence of China. My problem with Biden in terms of personnel selection, again, if personnel is policy, he's appointed too many people who believe in containment, that we contain the Soviet Union, so therefore we can contain China. China is not the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was a very weak and uneven superpower. That's why even a Soviet official referred to his own country as Upper Volga with nuclear weapons. He knew how backward they were in the 1970s in terms of their economy and their political role in the international community. China is the real thing. China is the #1 manufacturing country in the world. It's the #1 trader in terms of import and export. It could soon become the #1 economy in the world. Their Belt and Road Initiative is taking them all over the world, particularly into Africa and South America. And while we waste all of this money with military missions, we have military deployments in 100 countries. I don't think that's well understood on the Congress, let alone by the general public. China doesn't waste its resources that way. They invest in countries to build infrastructure and to take out raw materials. They are quite deficient in terms of energy resources and raw materials. So therefore, they move into particularly coastal countries where there are resources and trade off investments in infrastructure, building ports, building railroads, building airports in return for taking out precious metals, particularly in Africa. But they do this on a global basis. They are classic mercantile power. They bring in resources, they manufacture the resources, and they dominate the international market in terms of a lot of their commercial traffic. So what we're going to have to understand is China can't be contained, that you're going to have to find a working relationship with China. You're going to have to acknowledge that there are issues, some are adversarial, that require some thought, but some are competitive, particularly in the economic area, and some are cooperative. The United States and China have a lot in common in terms of international issues, controlling nuclear weapons, for example, controlling the nuclear inventory of North Korea. China supports us on that. China was a signer of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran. So they understand the problem of proliferation, and they're supportive. They understand the problem of climate. They understand a lot of the international issues. They're out there in the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean combating piracy. They're the second most active player in terms of donations to United Nations peacekeeping. So they have become a stakeholder in many areas, and we should take advantage of that. But then there's this problem of Taiwan. We thought we had resolved the problem in the 1970s, and that was with two presidencies. Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger certainly got a great deal of credit, as they should have, for opening the door to China. Jimmy Carter, who I don't think has gotten the credit he deserves for a lot of what he did, that was very important, finished the job with the official recognition in 1979 of China. And both Nixon and Carter agreed to one country, two systems. That is, there was Beijing and there was Taiwan. We're saying there was one country. We didn't identify which one, but we had official relations with Beijing and unofficial relations with Taiwan. Donald Trump challenged all that. And I'm afraid Joe Biden is continuing to a certain degree in that direction. And I think it's wrong. I noticed the Democratic platform for the 2020 election dropped the one country notion. I don't think that was smart. Biden invited the Taiwan emissary to attend the inauguration. That's never been done before. And he's looking for ways to increase official contacts with Taiwan. Taiwan is the last piece of territory that any Chinese dynasty once had claim to that they haven't absorbed. They're going to take very seriously any effort we make to manipulate the Taiwan problem. I'll get to Russia in a minute because we've done even worse with regard to Ukraine and Crimea, and we're going to have to sort that out as well if we're going to avoid a confrontation in that part of the world. But I think it's important to recognize that we can't do much about the Taiwan situation. We don't have a mutual defense commitment. We have a commitment to consult, but that's not the same thing as a commitment to defend. So whereas Bill Clinton in the 1990s, when China was putting pressure on Taiwan, could send a couple aircraft carriers into the Taiwan Straits, and China backed off. China is not in the mood to be backing off these days. So I think we should be looking for a diplomatic solution in that regard. it's very important to international security that the US-Chinese situation becomes a lot more stable than it is. And I would say the same thing for Russia. And what you don't get in the American press or American thinking generally is we really started the creation of this problem over Ukraine in many ways. I know it's conventional wisdom to blame Putin for everything, but you really have to go back to the 1990s. And this is when we were negotiating with the Soviets. The Soviet Union hadn't collapsed yet. That was 1991. But in 1990, East and West Germany were moving toward reunification. Well, there was a slight problem there. The Soviets still had 380,000 troops in East Germany. And how were we going to get them out of there? We weren't going to use military force to get them out of there. So instead, we had a two-pronged approach. Germany said they would pay for the relocation. Remember, the Soviet government was approaching bankruptcy in 1990. They didn't have a lot of extra hard currency. They said they would pay for the relocation of the troops, their housing back in the Soviet Union. And we said, and it was George W. Bush who said it, and James Baker said it, and he repeated it to me when I interviewed him for the Shevardnadze book. We will not, he told Foreign Minister Shevardnadze, we will not leapfrog over East Germany to go into Eastern Europe. Well, that's exactly what Bill Clinton did when he brought in the East European states of Poland and the Czech Republic and Hungary into NATO. And then George Bush went further. He brought in former Soviet republics, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. He was on the verge of working a way to bring in Ukraine and Georgia until Merkel got on the phone secretly and said, George, that's a red line for the Russians. You can't move in that direction. And this was at the point finally when George Bush stopped listening to Dick Cheney. Dick Cheney had totally worn out his welcome with George Bush and listened to Angela Merkel. But then if you fast forward to 2014, this was the year when the Ukrainian government was breaking up, and the United States was manipulating the political environment with a leading foreign service officer by the name of Victoria Nuland, who was in Kiev and was overheard on her cell phone. The Russians picked it up and published it, who should be in the Ukraine government and who shouldn't. And Putin just had enough. Seized Crimea, took Crimea back. It had always been part of Russia for the most part until Khrushchev gave it to Ukraine as a present, anniversary present in 1954. Everyone assumed Khrushchev had been drinking too much that night. Anyway, they've taken it back and they put troops on the border with Eastern Ukraine and manipulated militias in Eastern Ukraine. And now they're back with troops on the border. They removed some, but they still remain on the border. The solution to that problem is much like the Taiwan situation. We have to convince Russia we have no interest in putting Ukraine into NATO. It makes no sense. We've expanded NATO to the breaking point, as far as I'm concerned. I don't know if you're aware of this, but there are now 30 NATO members. That means we have mutual defense treaties with 29 European states. The last European state to come in was North Macedonia. Do you really think we should be guaranteeing the security of North Macedonia, let alone Croatia and Slovakia, and the Baltic states for that matter? We couldn't defend them. You know, when you go back to Taiwan, I at the War College and at the Defense Department, I played, and at CIA, war games involving the Pacific. And I can tell you one thing, I never took part in a war game where China didn't come out victorious in a war game that centered on Taiwan as the leading factor in the scenario. So we've got to find a way. We probably can't do what Nixon and Kissinger did so adroitly, mainly because Russia and China are no longer enemies. They have the best bilateral relationship they've had in over 60 years. You have to go back to the 1950s before the Cuban Missile Crisis to get a better relationship between Moscow and Beijing. And frankly, I think they're drawn to each other in part because of the opposition they face from the United States. And I think it's wrong. And I'll give you an example. I thought Blinken and Sullivan did a very poor job in Alaska in the meetings with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. But what the press didn't pick up on is when Wang Yi left those talks in Anchorage, he didn't go home to Beijing. He went to Moscow and consulted with the veteran foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. And in the wake of that, that's when Russia put troops on the border with Ukraine as part of a military exercise. And China started stepping up flights into Taiwan air identification space, putting pressure, military pressure on Taiwan. I think this was coordinated action. I think part of it was testing the Biden administration to see how they will react. And we still don't know how the Biden administration will react ultimately. But again, he's put in place too many people who are hostile to China and Russia. Victoria Nuland, who I mentioned, is now the #3 person in the State Department. In other words, the Undersecretary for Policy. I thought that was a very bad appointment. The chief Asian czar in the National Security Council is Kurt Campbell. Kurt Campbell is the one who came up with the idea of the pivot from the Middle East to the Pacific, telling China we're going to practice containment against you, which didn't go down well with Xi Jinping's China. And remember, Xi Jinping is the most powerful leader China has had since the death of Mao in the 1970s, 1976. So this is going to have to be sorted out. Now, in terms of time, I want to leave time for your questions and comments and any criticisms. Let me just make one final word here. I think Biden was correct to put emphasis on rebuilding the United States as a state. We have to rebuild our credibility in the international community. The international community has witnessed 4 years of Donald Trump. I think they found us pitiable. And then when you look at the 1 year of Trump's management of the pandemic in the European press, but also in Asia, they couldn't understand what in the world was happening to the United States. They couldn't believe we are as dysfunctional as we appear to be. Biden can't do much about that. It'll be interesting to see if he can even hold on to Democratic majorities in the next election. You know, the chances are the House is going to go back to the Republican Party in 2022. If they pick up as many seats in 2022 as they did in 2020, Kevin McCarthy, who's not the brightest bulb in the attic, will be Speaker of the House. And again, remember, in the first term of any new president in the modern era, the last 100 years, only twice has the party in the White House picked up seats in the House. The only exceptions were unusual. It was FDR in 1934 because he was trying to get us out of the Depression. And of course, George W. Bush in 2002, and that was because of 9/11 and the fears that 9/11 had created in this country. So I think what Biden needs to do to get into the international arena is use arms control as the center of a diplomatic emphasis to take the high ground, to restore America's position. And remember, arms control was the key to ending the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union in the wake of the Cuban Missile Crisis, with the various agreements and even the agreements that Ronald Reagan negotiated, you know, getting off this wicket of the Soviet Union as the evil empire and realizing he had to negotiate. And that made the difference with Gorbachev and Shevardnadze. And I think we have to do the same thing. But to do that, we have to drop the Cold War language of deterrence and negotiating from strength, which this administration is still spouting. The nuclear modernization, we've committed $1 trillion to modernizing nuclear weapons. We should be finding ways to get rid of nuclear weapons. You can't use them. They have no utility unless you just want to blow up the whole place. So that's where we are now. We have good people in place. I think Biden has some right ideas about the use of the military, and we'll see where this leads. So,
well, Mel, thank you very much for another interesting but also concerning assessment of our foreign policy. We are now To summarize for any of you late joiners, we are going to review the questions that have come in through the chat room. There's some very interesting ones, and Loretta Garcia will be doing that for us. And I think we will have time to open up to individual questions. And if I could open before Loretta answers the chats, Mel, in one of our preliminary discussions we had actually on Friday, and you said in arms control, we both were discussing cyber terrorism, and that may fall into that. And what you had recommended is there's a summit needed with some of the leaders of the world to actually create some form of cybersecurity accord or treaty. Now, my question would be, is how would those people be invited? Who would they be? Would North Korea be in on the same status as China and Russia? Would it be done through the United Nations? And also, would one of the ground rules be, with something I read recently, we had a security breach, I believe it was on Friday, with our pipelines in the east part of the country. A few months back, we had solar winds with the break-in of corporate and government data files. And so would one be an absolute rule that every country must observe, not interrupting the infrastructure of a country's own operations, transportation, rail, education, and so on? If you could just generally speak to that, and then Loretta can go on and read the questions.
Yeah, well, you have to tackle this on two levels. One, you have to engage the countries that have a lot to lose. So that would give you some leverage. So the first meeting should take place between the United States and Russia, and the United States and China, and then hopefully it would be good to engage trilaterally, US, Russia, China, for them to have an agreement of rules in the road. You know, what are the red lines? What can you not do in terms of using the cyber instrument, because it's out there and it will be used, but you shouldn't be allowed to compromise infrastructure. Now, fortunately, I think it hasn't been officially announced, but it looks like Biden and Putin will be meeting in either, my guess is Helsinki or Vienna. That's where these meetings are usually held in Europe, for 2 days of talks around June 15th, June 16th. And then hopefully we can gauge China. Once we've done that, then you can go to the countries that really are troublemaking countries. In that column, I would put the countries that have not as much to lose, but countries that use it as a weapon. And I would say North Korea, Iran, and Israel would be in that group. So that in that way, you'd identify all of the key cyber countries that have a lot at stake and have been very active in using the weapon. The problem was, when we first confronted the problem, was in the 2015, 2016 period over the election, and Obama's administration didn't take it as seriously as it should have, because it didn't want to compromise what they thought would be Hillary Clinton's victory. Let's face it, no one thought Donald Trump was going to win this election. Donald Trump didn't think he was going to win the election. So he missed a real opportunity. When Obama finally brought it up to Putin, Putin did get the message. And also when China raided the roles of the Office of Personnel Management and stole all of the personal information of hundreds of thousands of government employees, Obama did talk to Xi Jinping and got an understanding about rules of the road in terms of sensitive government matters. So this would be the precedent for that. And I think it could be done.
Thank you. Loretta, over to you with the chat questions, please. Thank you.
Hi, Mel. I'm Amy, Loretta's daughter. I'm going to be reading questions from the chat.
Yeah.
All right. If Afghanistan spirals into a full-out tribal war and the Taliban is successful in reimposing strict fundamentalism, and especially its repression of women following the U.S. withdrawal, how do you think the world will respond?
Well, sadly, I don't think there will be much of an international response. I think, sadly, there's not much you can do about the Afghan situation. One of the sad realities is some of the gains that have been made in terms of human rights, and particularly women's rights in Afghanistan, are going to be compromised. My hope is that the Taliban, and they will eventually restore their power in Kabul. Remember that they're Pathans. They're the majority tribe in the Taliban. They're not the minority. And they have the support of Pakistan, who we claim as an ally. Pakistan's never been our ally. They've been trying to get the Taliban back into Kabul. But the Kabul government is penniless. They can't operate without international assistance, including Western assistance and US assistance. I'm hoping the Taliban, which doesn't have goals beyond Afghanistan itself, that's where we misread the situation in 2001 when we drove them out of the capital at that time, will realize that there are limits to what they can do. Now, there was just a terrible explosion at a school and involving a lot of children, women particularly, who were killed. I don't think that necessarily was the Taliban. The problem that Afghanistan faces and that the Taliban faces is the Islamic State. Remember, they're not allies. So it's not going to be easy even for the Taliban to restore order. And there's some reason to think that they may have to control some of their worst instincts. Now, the hope here is father to the thought. There's no guarantee. But if we couldn't do anything about Afghanistan with over 100,000 troops, and the Soviet Union couldn't do anything about Afghanistan with 125,000 troops, what do you think there is for our military to do? So this is a bad situation that will probably get worse in the near term.
There was another question kind of along those same lines, so I'll read it and see if you have anything else that you want to add. Has the U.S. done enough, in your opinion, either in money or effort to transform the society in Afghanistan?
Oh, they've done too much. We've wasted $2 trillion in Afghanistan. I mean, what are the limits here? You know, when we went into Afghanistan in October of 2001, we went in for a reason, to drive al-Qaeda out of the country. We did that in 3 months. At that point, that would have been January 2002, we should have taken the keys to the country and given them back to the Afghans and say, look, you've tried to manage your country before, you're going to have to do it again. Not stayed around for nearly 2 decades. And Chinese have said to us privately, in talking about our role in Iraq and our role in Afghanistan, they said to us, what are you, crazy? Why do you waste your resources in that fashion? You don't see the Chinese doing anything that's stupid. We have no control over these situations. So why do we compromise all of this treasure and over 2,000 people who've been killed, American servicemen and women, and who knows how many civilians have been killed, and the misuse of drones. You know, whenever I write about the drones, when I don't submit anything to the CIA anymore, I don't trust them, so why should I even have them review my product? They would take out everything I wrote about drones, saying it's secret. Well, drones aren't secret to anybody. The President of the United States discussed drone policy in public at the National War College, where I used to teach. So again, we're kidding ourselves. But a lot of innocent civilians have been killed by drones. And particularly in the Trump era, when the rules for the use of the drone were made a lot easier for the military to take advantage of.
Okay, next question. The United States maintains such a large military with 150 plus bases abroad. Other countries like Sweden, Germany, and Spain have reduced their military and prospered. Do you think the US would do the same in the near future?
No, and that's unfortunate. And it's, did the question say 150 bases and facilities abroad?
150 plus.
Yeah, it's over 700. When I did my work on the book I did, National Insecurity, I came up with a list of 700 to 800 facilities. Now, forget comparing us to Sweden and Germany. They're our allies. Compare us to China and Russia. China has one base outside of its own zone of influence. That's in Djibouti, and they're working with us on piracy. The Russians have an air and naval facility in Syria. That's the only military facilities they have outside of the former Soviet space. So why do we need all of these bases and operating facilities? Now, some of this is to support their aircraft carrier. Well, China has come up with a weapons system, an anti-ship cruise missile, which means we couldn't even deploy a carrier successfully against China. We couldn't bring it within range where it could operate because of the extensive operating capacity that their cruise missiles had. So we need to rethink the entire military geopolitical arena. And unfortunately, when Biden announced he was going to do that, he gave the task to Secretary of Defense Austin. It shouldn't have gone to Austin. It should have gone to the Department of State. What we need to revive in this country is the role of diplomacy, getting back to the days of Dean Acheson and the post-World War II environment, when the United States did so much that was worthwhile from 1945 to 1950, but gradually the Department of State has essentially faded away as a policy organization. There have been exceptions. John Kerry was an outstanding Secretary of State. The military has gained too much stature. You've had militarization of national security, militarization of intelligence, and even this last defense budget, Biden had a small increase for the military. That's sending the wrong signal. You've got to get military spending under control. We spend more than the entire world does on the military and intelligence. $1.25 trillion, not the 780 billion you read about in the press. That's just the Pentagon. Add in the Department of Energy, add in the intelligence community, add in Veterans Affairs and certain aspects of the Department of Homeland Security. It's outrageous, and I don't see anyone doing anything about it.
Okay, to switch gears a little bit, why was the declaration of Turkey's killing of Armenians as a genocide important? Seems like a grain of sand in comparison to other issues.
Well, it's it's not a grain of sand to the Armenian community. It's something that we needed to recognize, and for over 100 years, we dodged it because we were afraid of the Turkish reaction. This was long overdue. This was an outrageous genocide of a people. And to allow Turkey to lie about it and to allow Turkish officials to misstate the facts, Turkish intellectuals, Turkish writers know what happened in the genocide. International bodies, historians know what happened. It's important to declare that and move on, but to acknowledge it. Why should that be covered up? You cover up that, you could cover up the Holocaust. You could cover up what happened in Rwanda. That shouldn't be done.
Given how aggressive the GOP is working to restrict Democratic voting in 2022 and 2024, what do you think we can do prior to the 2024 elections?
Well, the important thing is what the founding fathers said about elections, and that's participation. If we participate, and of course it's participation that's being compromised, and we remain active and we remain engaged, I think the votes will be there. But the fact is this country is terribly polarized. So it's going to take that kind of activity. Now, I look at January the 6th and what happened at Capitol Hill the same way I look at 9/11. They were both intelligence failures. They were both wake-up calls. 9/11 was the wake-up call to international terrorism. January 6th should have been the wake-up call to domestic terrorism. I think under Merrick Garland at the Justice Department and under the new Department of Homeland Security, I think we'll get greater recognition that, Walt Kelly had a character Pogo who said, "I've met the enemy and he is us." The enemy is at home. The enemy, there are no existential threats to the United States from abroad. If there's an existential threat in this country now, it's the threat of white supremacy and racism. And it needs to be addressed. And I think Biden certainly understands that.
Is the US doing enough to maintain its goodwill with Pakistan?
I don't blame the United States for the lack of goodwill with Pakistan. Pakistan is not our ally. Our friend in South Asia should be India. I'd be prepared to dissociate ourselves from Pakistan. We probably can't do that because there's so much instability in Pakistan, a country that has a couple hundred nuclear devices. There's always the threat of a Islamic or Islamist takeover in Pakistan, which would put nuclear weapons in the hands of the wrong people. But generally, to me, the major power in that part of the world that should get our attention is India. And India will help us in terms of what we need to do diplomatically vis-a-vis China. Let China worry about Pakistan. They're the ones who prop up Pakistan anyway. But because of the nuclear weapons issue, we can't just entirely walk away from the situation. But Pakistan has been lying to us and misleading us for nearly 20 years over the Taliban issue. And as I said, we've been trying to deny the Taliban a role in Afghanistan, while the Pakistan has provided sanctuary for the Taliban and doing their best to get them back into Kabul. And there's a reason for that. Pakistan's number one enemy isn't to the West, it's not Afghanistan, it's India. They're obsessed with the threat from India. So they want to get a power back in Kabul they can control, such as the Taliban, and concentrate on India, which does worry them. And they have fought wars with India. And it's a mess that Britain left behind in 1947 when they were bankrupt after the end of World War II and had to evacuate South Asia. And then they screwed up in the Suez Canal in 1956 and they had to leave the Middle East. And every time Britain had to leave a place, the good old United States stepped in and often mismanaged the situation.
Will Khashoggi's murder and dismemberment go unpunished?
Oh, it's already gone unpunished. Trump lied about that. And now I think that even Biden, who said all the right things during the campaign, is now cozying back up to Saudi Arabia. And the arms deals, I think that were being re-examined. It looks like those restrictions are being lifted, and I think it's wrong. The countries of the Middle East have to understand that the tail is not going to wag the dog. In other words, Israel has to be told there are limits to what we can tolerate with their abuses against the Palestinians. And the Saudis have to understand the same thing about the war crimes they've committed in Yemen. But we don't seem to operate in that regard. And I think that's unfortunate. And again, when you identify the major powers in the region, the country we need to get a stable relationship with is, believe it or not, Iran. I mean, Iran has tremendous potential for making US life very difficult in the Middle East. We can improve that situation. But it's kind of ironic when you think of the two countries that dominate the press in terms of problems for the United States. Everyone talks about North Korea and Iran. Well, name two important countries where we don't have embassies, where we don't have diplomatic representation, where we don't have diplomatic recognition. Well, it's Pyongyang and Tehran. Does that make any sense at all? I mean, it's, get back to diplomacy. It doesn't, you don't need embassies in Paris and France, or Paris and or Paris and Berlin and London, but you do need embassies in Tehran and Pyongyang. They can do a lot of good.
On that note, we have another question. Are the US and Iran destined to be adversaries? Could or would the exalted place Iran had under the Nixon doctrine return?
Well, when you talk about an exalted place, are you talking about our support for the Shah? If Trump had stayed in the White House for another 4 years, God forbid, there could have been a war between the United States and Iran. Israel is doing its best to create a military confrontation with Iran. They're engaging in warfare against Iran. They're blowing up nuclear sites. They're assassinating nuclear scientists on the streets of Tehran. They're targeting Iranian ships in the Red Sea and the Mediterranean. We don't need war with Iran. I think we've had enough experience with war and permanent war and the global war against terror to realize that we've made a lot of terrible mistakes. And I think moving in the direction of some state-to-state relationship with Iran, even though there are limits to how far they will go because they're still in this revolutionary influence of the Ayatollahs, but the relationship doesn't have to be as bad as it is. And I think Obama and Secretary of State Kerry were moving us in that direction, and Trump came along and threw it all away, like just about everything else he touched. You know, the damage he's done to U.S. interest is at home and abroad is remarkable.
Given the numerous nationalist and populist leaders, who do you see on the world stage taking positive leadership supporting international cooperation, especially as Merkel is leaving office soon?
Wow, that's a very interesting question. Right now, I think the world is devoid of international leadership, that there's a real vacuum of power, and that Biden, if he uses the experience he has, you know, we've rarely elected someone with so much experience in international affairs. His role in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, often as chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And I remember in the 80s when I was at CIA briefing Biden in that committee quite a few times. He has this understanding, but it means rebuilding the State Department, rebuilding diplomacy, because if you look at the global community, and the pandemic has worsened this situation, there are trends against globalization and trends in favor of ultranationalism that have produced leaders like Modi in India, or Bolsonaro in Brazil, or Erdogan in Turkey. Macron is under a lot of pressure from Le Pen in France. Britain has made itself irrelevant with Brexit. Huge mistake that they can't seem to correct, and maybe even lose parts of the British Empire, starting with Scotland, as a result of that decision. You certainly don't want leadership in the hands of a Putin or a Xi Jinping. So Biden has a real opportunity to seize the high ground. And as I said earlier, I think arms control is one of the ways to do that. Revive the agreements, particularly the ones we've abrogated. Do something about, do it. When I left the CIA, China had a very interesting deployment situation with nuclear weapons. The warheads were not on the launchers. The warheads were in one place, the launchers were in another place. We don't do it that way, nor does Russia. The warheads are on the launchers. That's dangerous. It's not stable. And also, when I looked into nuclear security, Israel was the only country with nuclear weapons where the president, like a Netanyahu, couldn't solely make a decision about using nuclear weapons. He would have to consult with the national security team. Well, there's nothing stopping the president of the United States authorizing the use of nuclear weapons, nor is there a system in place in Russia to stop Putin. Dumb luck got us out of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And dumb luck has helped us for the last nearly 60 years. At some point, we may run out of dumb luck. And that's what I would worry about. So the whole field of nuclear security and nuclear safety needs to be addressed. But remember, you're up against the Pentagon that's fought every arms control agreement that we ever signed, going back to Kennedy and the Partial Test Ban Treaty. Don't forget that.
What should be the U.S. response to the Chinese 9-dash line?
Well, I don't think, the 9-dash line goes back to before Mao. It was created by the Kuomintang, Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist groups. And basically, if you look at the South China Sea, it was to carve out a zone of influence. So if you go from north to south, too bad we don't have a map for us. When you look at the north, Japan and the Korean Peninsula, then in the central part, in terms of Taiwan, and then the southern part, the South China Sea and the islands, including the Spratlys, they're countries with claims within that 9-dash map or 9-dash line that are much closer to the Spratlys than China. The Philippines, Malaysia, Vietnam all have better claims, and international courts have recognized these claims and have disabuse China of the notion that they have legitimacy over these islands, but that hasn't stopped them from militarizing these islands. Xi Jinping wanted to negotiate this with Obama, and Obama didn't want to get into the conversation in 2012, 2013. Well, he should have engaged that conversation, because now they're militarizing the islands. They're building runways that will accommodate strategic aircraft. The only thing we can do, I think, and that we should do, and I think we are doing, is enforce freedom of navigation. We've got to keep our Navy out there. We can't allow the Chinese to close off the South China Sea. Tremendous amounts of international commerce go through those waters. Huge amounts. Remember, Asia is just a trading region. So the South China Sea is, remember I said I don't like the word strategy or strategic, that it's overused. The South China Sea is strategic in that regard. I'll make an exception there.
What is the potential of the Peace Corps in public diplomacy?
Well, it was a brilliant idea in the Kennedy administration. I'm in favor of all of these person-to-person contacts that were started under Eisenhower. Kennedy continued with the Peace Corps, humanitarian food programs. Peace Corps was a vital institution. Of course, the pandemic, I don't know what's left of the Peace Corps anymore in this environment, but in a post-pandemic age, if we ever get there, institutions such as the Peace Corps are vital. And if you believe in humanitarian development and disarmament and negotiated solution to outstanding differences, the Peace Corps could do the United States a lot of good, because we've made major contributions, and we used to get credit for that kind of thing.
That's the last question.
Isn't support for the Department of Defense about supporting the military-industrial complex as Eisenhower feared?
Wait, I don't quite understand. Repeat that again.
Isn't support for the DoD about supporting the military-industrial complex as Eisenhower feared?
We don't. Yes, I mean, the military-industrial complex is a problem. But I taught at the National War College, part of the Department of Defense, for 18 years. And I'll say something rather shocking to you. The Department of Defense is a peace institution. It's not a war institution. Think of all the wars we've fought since World War II. The Department of Defense was not in favor of any of them. These were brought to you by what David Halberstam called the best and the brightest. It's civilians who get us into war. It's the Rostow brothers who were with Kennedy, or the Bundy brothers who were with Kennedy, or idiots like John Bolton who get us into wars. The military will always tell you the limits on the use of force, the importance of restraint, the importance of constraint, the importance of limitations. The problem is, once you send the military into war, they don't know how to let go. They still are fighting getting out of Afghanistan. They fought getting out of Vietnam, and then they found other people to blame for their lack of success when they were sent on a fool's errand. It was an unwinnable war. They shouldn't have been sent there in the first place. I blame Lyndon Johnson. Kennedy wouldn't have done what Johnson did. I'm convinced of that. So yeah, the military-industrial complex is a bad thing. The defense budget is more like a jobs bill. You have senators from various states who won't let go of these programs, want to build weapons that the Pentagon doesn't even want. The Pentagon's not asking for more tanks. It's states where these tanks are built. Maryland is a huge gainer from the military-industrial complex when you look at what's given to Maryland for the military. Or you look at California, you have these very liberal senators like Dianne Feinstein, and when you had Barbara Boxer, the other so-called liberals, but they didn't do anything about hurting Lockheed Martin when Lockheed Martin wanted something in the defense budget so they could build their F-35. And if you look at the F-35, the most expensive weapons program we've ever engaged in, I think parts for the F-35 fighter aircraft are built in 47 of our 50 states. What does that tell you about marketing and job promotion from our defense bill? So it's going to be a difficult task taking that one on.
Well, thank you, Mel. as we now have to wrap up this session, firstly, Amy, I want to thank you very much for an excellent job in coordinating these questions. You did a great job there. And as we come to the conclusion of this season, Mel, we sincerely thank you. Again, we often at River Road say how lucky we are to be living in DC with so many interesting people, so willing to share. As they say, it's probably America's largest small town, and consider you part of our family. And next fall when we reconvene, we hope you will accept an invitation for your annual talk again.
I enjoy the sessions there, and as the Chinese keep telling us, may you live in interesting times. Well,
thank you very much. Well, first, then in conclusion is Loretta Garcia does a lot of effort to record these, then edit them. So this will be posted on the River Road Facebook page for Contemporary Issues Forum. Is that direct? Loretta, do you want to say exactly how to find that for our guest here?
Sure, it is now a public group. So if you are on Facebook, you just search in your search box for Contemporary Issues Forum, and it'll come up. There, you may still see the private group, but don't click that one. Click the public group, and you'll see this will be posted, as
Great.
will our most recent.
And does that remain posted for a while period of time?
It remains posted forever. It will have the description, it will have the date, and things are posted in chronological order. So it will be posted at the top of the page. It will be the most post.
So you can remember that, Mel, to tell your grandkids in decades to come that your knowledge will be shared to the world. Thank you.
It will remain as long as Facebook remains.
Right, and I'll send you the direct link, Mel.
Okay, no.
Thank you very much.
Our website and the Center for International Policy's website.
Yes, that's great. So then remember that Mel will offer any of us to join his book launch on Wednesday, June 16th at 7 p.m. And you can join that through his website, melvingoodman.com. And if you want to procure any of his books, also his books are always available at Politics and Prose. And thank you everyone for attending. Mel, you've done a wonderful job for us. Everyone have a great summer, and we will be in touch through the email about our fall series kicking off.
Bye, Mel. It was
And happy Mother's Day to everyone.
Good seeing you.
Thank you all.
great.
Bye.
Yeah,
Bye.
really enjoyed.
Good show.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.